They called our world Lyriath Prime. To me, it was simply home. Not the place of myths or radiance the off-worlders wrote about, but the smell of mist-drenched moss under 3 pale moons, the distant songs of light-dwelling birds echoing from crystalline towers, and the deep warmth of my bond cluster gathered around the old fire spheres. I never imagined the name Prime would one day be scorched onto military maps beside words like extraction zone and burned sectors. I never imagined I'd carry that same name into a war that would redefine my species and shatter everything I believe about humanity. My designation is Thale, born of the Western root caste. My skin once held the soft hue of earth after rain. It is ash-colored now, burned by the sun of a foreign world and the memories of those we left behind. Before the war, I was a knowledge analyst, trained to study xenolinguistic trends in human broadcasts. We knew them as a volatile but limited species, clever in unexpected ways, but young, so young, and so full of fire. When the first contact accord collapsed and diplomacy gave way to orbital strikes, I was one of thousands reassigned to coalition's field divisions. At the time, I thought an honor. I wore the engraved plates of the 3rd Voice Brigade, a language interpreter embedded in frontline infantry. I believed that could still be a bridge. That understanding could be salvaged from a fire. I was wrong. They trained us in the orbital rings that loomed above our dying satellites. Days stretched into weeks of oxygen-thin drills and rapid adaptation to low-frequency weapons and sound-based detonation waves. Human innovations that our science had once dismissed as crude. But there was nothing crude about them. Not after we saw the first casualty footage. Flesh was no match for their fire. Their steel, their fury. My commander, Veos, was hardened from the Gennari conflict and wore his scars like ceremonial braid. He had no illusions about humans. They were born from struggle, he told us. It's etched into their nervous systems. They don't fear extinction, they weaponize it. I didn't believe him then. I still carried an old hope that there might be a line they wouldn't cross. Veos assigned me to Fire Team Echo 9, a tight cluster of 8. Most of them didn't speak much. We weren't trained for camaraderie. We were taught to advance, decode, survive. I remember Isari, the medic, who whispered ancient oaths before every mission. I remember Drell, too, the heavy artillery bearer, who once painted stars on the inside of his armor just to remember home. We all clung to small things. Rituals. Ghosts. Our first deployment was to the lower atmosphere of Terra Sector 4, a zone Earth-based forces had codenamed Marrow Divide. It was a broken stretch of terrain where once, long ago, they said rivers had flowed and cities had shimmered beneath glass. Now it was rubble. The sun there was red and distant, filtered through ash clouds and electromagnetic chaff. Nothing moved without noise, and nothing lived without hiding. I had just adjusted the atmospheric filters on my visor when we saw our first human corpses. Their armor was scorched, cracked open like old exoshells, the flesh beneath blackened and exposed. One still clutched a photo, laminated, frayed, of a small human creature, a child perhaps, smiling without understanding the world it had been born into. I tried to look away. Veos did not. Remember, he said. They grieved, too. What none of us expected was the silence. It wasn't that the humans weren't there. They were. We saw movement on scanners, shadows in the fog, heat signatures that blinked in and out like will-o-wisps. But they didn't confront us head-on. Not at first. Instead, they let us advance. Let us feel safe. Then, when the path narrowed between 2 collapsed towers, the ground beneath us opened. Free of echo, 9 were gone in a heartbeat, vaporized by a directional charge laced with barometric sensors. Drell screamed, his left arm mangled, bone exposed through torn muscle. Isari dragged him back, howling incantations that no longer had meaning. I froze. I had trained for language, for negotiation, for diplomacy through conflict. Not this. The humans emerged from the dust, dark forms in adaptive armor, glowing red nodes on their helmets like predatory eyes. Their rifles were compact, brutal, nothing like our plasma stabilizers. They didn't fire first. They waited. Let us see them. Let us understand that we were prey, not opponents. Then they moved as one, methodical, practiced, Not a single wasted step. I tried to signal surrender. We had codes for it. Light pulses, waveform submissions. But they didn't respond. They didn't recognize our terms. Or they didn't care. Veo stepped in front of me. I remember the sound his body made when the first round hit. A sharp crack, then silence. Just like that, our leader was gone. Something in me broke open. I remember firing wildly, words screaming from my throat in both our tongue and theirs. Commands, please, fragments of a lost language. I hit nothing. We weren't meant to win. We were meant to be reminders that even alien civilizations could bleed. Later we escaped, or what was left of U.S. did. Isari carried Drell until he stopped breathing. Then she carried only his armor. We regrouped with fragments of another team. Faces I didn't know. Eyes I couldn't meet. I wanted to ask, why didn't they answer? But I already knew. The war wasn't just about territory. It was about memory. About fear. Humanity had carved their own survival from extinction over and over again. We thought we could outthink them. We didn't realize they'd learned to make instinct a weapon. When the days stretched long and rations turned sour, we began to hear the broadcasts. Human voices overcaptured frequencies, looping phrases like barbed wire. You don't belong here. Go home or die like the last wave. Some were distorted music. Others were laughter, mocking, taunting. I translated them for the survivors. I don't know why. Perhaps I wanted them to hear what I heard, that we had crossed a line we couldn't uncross. One night, after a failed extraction, Isari and I found shelter beneath the remnants of a human structure, something ancient with stained glass and shattered wood, a place of their worship. Perhaps she asked me if I thought they had gods. I said I didn't know, but I thought if they did, they'd abandoned them long ago. Isari didn't make it to morning. Now, when I close my eyes, I still see her shadow against the flame-lit ruins. Still feel the vibrations of human boots approaching in the distance. Still hear the silence that comes just before they strike. This was only the beginning. I didn't know then that things could get worse. That the red-eyed ones were only scouts. That deeper horrors waited in the next sector. That survival would come not through courage, but through surrender. But I would learn. Every step into their world taught me something new. About fear. About war. About what it means to be broken and still breathing. And about the truth no soldier ever wants to admit. That sometimes the enemy is not the one who fires first, but the one who refuses to speak at all. We were pulled from crater cities before our bones had cooled, shipped off-planet by a rusted bulk carrier whose hull was still scorched from last cycle's bombardment. They said we were being reassigned to Earth, the human core, the front that burned the longest. No one spoke, not even to ask why. The ship trembled with each jump like it was trying to shake us loose, as if even the vessel knew we weren't coming back. I spent most of the trans alone, strapped into a narrow sleep frame beside the medical bay where they kept what was left of Drell's armor. They had cleaned it, polished the burn marks, sealed the gaps where shrapnel had torn through, and then placed it in a vacuum-sealed shroud like it was holy. It wasn't. It was empty. Just like the words they printed onto the manifest. Honored remains. They were just pieces now. We all were. Earth's atmosphere hit us like a scream. The drop module didn't glide. It tore through the sky, shaking apart clouds of ash and magnetic soot as if the planet was trying to swallow us before we landed. The command brief called the region Delta Cold Quadrant, though the humans called it Ashvale. That name made more sense. Everything was gray. Not the silver gray of our cities or the pale marble of our moons, but the kind of gray that soaks into your lungs and makes you forget color ever existed. We landed in the shell of an old metropolis. Broken high-rises, melted glass, monorail bones twisted around each other like rusted ligaments. No civilians. No wildlife. Just silence, smoke, and the stench of something long dead but not yet buried. And then came the orders. Advance 3 clicks east. Secure ruins. Confirm enemy presence. Hold until reinforced. Cold commands. Type not spoken. They didn't send us alone. We were assigned to the 16th Integration Unit, a hybrid task group, half of them from Uran fields, born of heat and alloy, Others like me, language techs embedded in infantry roles. But the humans, they didn't embed. They dominated. They arrived in exosuits painted matte black, their faces hidden behind reflective visors pulsing faint red from within. I never saw their eyes. Not once. Only the lights. The one who led them didn't give a name. She or he, I couldn't tell. Spoke through a synthesized voice box tuned to a flat, almost bored frequency. Orders are issued. Execution begins now. Stay out of our perimeter, or you will be collateral. We weren't allies. We were obstacles. Interference. The mission was simple in design, brutal in practice. Sweep Sector Delta, 37. Confirm and clear. But nothing about Earth was ever simple. The buildings weren't just ruined. They were haunted. Shadows moved without light. Walls whispered, not from ghosts, but from cloaked sensors, vibration mines, sonic displacers. Every floor was a trap. Every stairwell a potential grave. I walked point with 2 Euron soldiers, Tal and Viren, who communicated in clipped electro clicks only I could fully understand. We cleared 6 levels before the first contact. Not a firefight. Not even an ambush. Just disappearance. 1 second. Tal was ahead of me, aiming down the corridor. The next, he was gone. No flash. No scream. Just static. And then a red dot on my visor blinking out like a dying star. The human response was immediate and cold. Adjust formation. Loss acknowledged. Continue sweep. Viren hesitated. He always did. But the human captain raised one hand, and a pulse crackled from her palm. A warning, not an order. Do not falter. We moved on. I started counting footsteps again. It's a habit that began after Isari died. I think it helps me keep time. Or maybe it just helps me forget where I am. We found what remained of Tal 20 minutes later. Folded into a wall of living concrete, the same tech humans once used to terraform. Except it had been corrupted. The biomatrix had rewritten itself, absorbed him, then died with him still inside. His face was fused into the polymer, his eyes still open. Viren broke then, not outwardly, but I saw it, the flicker in his posture, the drop in heat signature. It was a soul leaving a shell. We didn't say anything. There was nothing worth saying. Words don't mend when the wound is too deep. That night, if it was even night, the human unit made camp in a sunken plaza surrounded by broken sculpture, twisted effigies of men in suits and glass-eyed children pointing at futures they would never see. The humans didn't remove their helmets, didn't speak unless required. They moved like machines, fed through tubes, and only interacted with one another through gesture and encrypted comms. I realized, watching them, that they weren't soldiers. They were survivors given permission to kill. One of them watched me more than the others. His, or its, visor flicked in a slow pulse every time I moved. I didn't know if he was curious or waiting for a reason to shoot. Maybe both. I tried not to think about it. I failed. Viren approached me in the dark, sitting against the foot of a shattered monument. He didn't ask if I was all right. None of us were. But he said something that stayed with me longer than anything else from that deployment. They have no rhythm, he said. No pulse. They don't wait for wind or instinct. They kill without tempo. He was right. Everything about humanity was asymmetrical. They didn't march. They pounced. Their strategies bent time and logic. Sometimes they vanished for days. Other times, they hit every wall at once like wildfire. And when they were quiet, that's when you knew to be afraid. The next morning, we reached the relay node, an ancient piece of human tech, once used to balance communications across hemispheres. It was supposed to be decommissioned. It wasn't. There were bodies tied to it. Not alien. Human. Stripped of gear. Hung like warnings. Their skin peeled with acid, messages carved into flesh. Not words, symbols. And beneath them, crude audio loops broadcasting a signal only our kind would decode. My translator caught fragments. They lied to you. We begged them to stop. This is your inheritance. Viren wanted to leave it. I told him we couldn't. Orders were secure the node and cleanse any hostiles. But it was already too late. The moment I linked to the relay's frequency, It activated a secondary beacon. A flare of sound shot into the sky, and from the ruins above us, the air began to shift. Then came the drones. Hundreds, maybe more, screeching from above, small enough to pass through crumbled ceilings, fast enough to outmaneuver pulse fire. Some carried payloads. Others simply recorded. The humans reacted immediately, pulling into formation, rifles raised, eyes glowing like embers in fog. They didn't ask who launched the drones. They didn't care. One command was issued. Engage all movement. Terminate. Recover core. The first explosion was behind us. Then another. Screams. Alien, human, indistinguishable. The drones didn't discriminate. They tore through us like glass. I lost Viren somewhere in the chaos. 1 second. He was beside me, pushing me down beneath a wrecked pillar. The next, I felt a wet heat across my face. His blood wasn't red. It glowed faintly like starfire. It sank into my skin before I could wipe it away. By the time the sky cleared, only 3 of us were left standing. 2 humans and me. No orders came after that. No med-evac. No reinforcements. The mission had served its purpose. The relay was destroyed. The enemy, whoever they were, had struck and we had bled. The taller human approached me then. His visor retracted for the first time. I saw only part of his. We were no longer a unit. We were fragments. Splinters of something once organized and orderly, now scattered across scorched corridors and soot-soaked ruins. The humans didn't speak about the losses. They didn't even look at the bodies. Their dead were dragged into piles, tagged with identifiers, and burned with fuel that left no scent behind. Ash to ash, smoke to silence. Efficient, emotionless. But I noticed the smallest twitch in the one with the scarred face. His hand clenched tighter every time the flames rose. That was enough. They weren't machines. They just didn't want to be seen mourning. The conflict had changed shape. We weren't holding ground anymore. We were chasing shadows through ghosted districts. Intelligence from high orbit reported irregular energy signatures in the old Magrail tunnels. No confirmation, just patterns, heat clusters, short-wave bursts, sudden temperature drops. All signs of activity, but not of who or what. So they sent us in. The red-eyed ones, humans in exoframes enhanced with synthetic reflex processors, led the descent. Their armor was newer than what I'd seen before. Sleeker, more fluid. The visors now displayed not just pulses of red, but shifting bands of violet and blue, like war had evolved into something spectral. I'd studied enough human mythology to recognize the reference, the color of vengeance, the shade of revenants. The tunnels swallowed sound. Our footsteps echoed as if mocked by the ghosts of cities above. No wind, no dust, only the smell of oxidized steel and mold that had learned to live without light. I walked second from the rear, rifle loose in my hands. Translator node ticking faintly as it scanned the darkness for any whisper of language. That was when I first saw her. She was human, or had been once. Slight in stature, clad in patchwork armor welded from scavenged pieces of both our technologies. Her face bore no mask, only pale lines etched deep around her eyes, and hair pulled tight into a ragged braid. No insignia, no unit ID, just a blue flare held high in her hand, casting everything around her in cold flame. The lead exo-unit raised its weapon. She didn't move, didn't speak. The flare pulsed once, then twice. My translator screamed, "Do not fire." It was old code, pre-war, the kind used in the early contact days when ambassadors still believed in compromise. But the soldiers didn't hesitate. Their weapons ignited. I lunged forward before the first round could reach her. My cry wasn't words. It was instinct. A shield burst from my suit, thin as breath but enough to deflect the initial spray. She didn't flinch, didn't retreat. She let the flare drop, and when it hit the floor, it released a bloom of electric light that forced every visor into emergency dimming. Then came the real attack. From the darkness behind her, they emerged. Not soldiers, not organized, but fast. Starved, covered in armor painted with blood and circuit tracings. Human defectors, survivors, or rebels. I couldn't tell anymore. Some wore pieces of our old uniforms. Others had crude tattoos of Earth continents scorched onto their flesh. They weren't here to win. They were here to destroy. The tunnel erupted. I remember the feel of the ceiling cracking overhead, the rush of concrete and flame, the static jamming my comms. I remember the red-eyed unit beside me being split apart by a thermal lance wielded by a man who laughed the entire time. I remember falling. The ground caught me like a jealous god, eager to claim something back. When I came to, the fight had moved deeper into the tunnels. The echoes had changed. Fewer gunshots. More screams. My head was ringing. My suit's telemetry was dead. I was alone, pinned beneath a support beam, blood thick in my throat. And then she appeared again. The flare woman. She knelt beside me without fear. Her eyes were a dull green bloodshot and rimmed with the kind of fatigue only those who bury their own can carry. She didn't speak right away. She just placed a hand against my chest plate and tapped it twice. A heartbeat. Mine was still there. She whispered something then, a word I didn't understand. My translator fumbled, stuttered, then offered, "Witness." I asked her why. Why spare me? Why protect me in the crossfire of a battle that no longer respected sides? Her answer was quiet, measured, because you tried to stop them from firing. That was all it took. She helped lift the beam. Her strength was unnatural for someone so small, enhanced by exofiber webbing across her arms. Every movement was slow, deliberate. She didn't treat me as an enemy, just as a piece of wreckage worth saving. The tunnel shook again. We moved, downward, away from the conflict, through passages lined with graffiti that pulsed faintly, luminescent ink formed into symbols that weren't just human. Some were ours. Some were combinations I'd never seen. Hybrid ideograms. Unity scrawled in desperation. Eventually, we reached a chamber sealed by a door of melted alloy. She keyed in a pattern on the panel, and it hissed open with a moan. Inside, a dozen figures turned, half human, half alien, none holding weapons. They were survivors. From both sides. There was an old Varkari priest with prayer rods strapped to what remained of his broken limbs. A human child with silver implants across her skull, speaking in the polyphonic hum of our old training networks. A former coalition soldier, Khalif, I later learned, his voice raw from smoke, his lungs scarred by Earth's poisons, but his spirit intact. They weren't soldiers anymore. They were the unwanted, the ones neither side could use or kill. They called themselves the Chorus. Their leader, the Flare Woman, was known only as Mara. She told me what had happened to the last team that reached them. A human strike squad had leveled their hideout 3 days before. No warning. No survivors among the outer ring. Only the core remained. Hiding. Waiting. Listening. And now they had me. The others were wary. I didn't blame them. I still wore my field plate, etched with coalition sigils. I still looked like the enemy. But Mara vouched for me. Her word was all they accepted. Over the next days, I learned more from that shattered band than from all my training. They spoke of the war not as history, but as trauma, alive, unresolved. They knew it would never end on a battlefield. That peace wouldn't come from treaties or kills, but from those brave enough to stop the cycle mid-turn. That was their mission now, intercepting information, smuggling defectors, documenting the horrors both sides tried to erase. They had archives, footage, testimonies, records of war crimes committed by humans and by us. No propaganda, just truth, raw and unbearable. They wanted me to speak, not just as a translator, but as a witness. Mara asked, "When you return to your people, if you return, what will you say?" I didn't have an answer then, but I knew I couldn't stay hidden forever. The war above still burned. The silence had only grown louder, and I was starting to hear in my dreams. I left the chorus after 13 Earth rotations, not because I was forced to, not because I wanted to, because Mara told me it was time. "There are some things we can't carry into silence," she said, resting one scarred hand against the rusted hull of the elevator shaft that would return me to the surface. "But you can speak without being deafened." I didn't argue. I couldn't. The air in those tunnels had grown heavier by the day, soaked with secrets, names, and truths that had no place in reports. My lungs ached to breathe under a sky again, no matter how poisoned. I was no longer a soldier, not in function, but I was still something useful. I was still a witness. Mara handed me a datapod before we parted, an encoded archive containing voices, imagery, records pulled from across the war zones, not just from rebels and defectors, from civilians, field medics, executed prisoners, from children whose only crime was being born under the wrong flag, a map of grief too wide to be drawn by one species alone. She said nothing when I took it, just looked at me with eyes no longer interested in victory, only survival. I ascended alone. The world above hadn't changed. The sky still sagged under the weight of smoke and orbital fire. The ruins still groaned like they remembered better times. But something had shifted, or maybe it was just me. My old unit was gone. No signals. No records. My frequency alerts were met with static or corrupted return pings. I assumed they had been either reassigned or removed. That was how it worked. War erased people without needing to explain why. I walked for days through what remained of Sector Delta, avoided patrols, slept in ventilation ducts and abandoned transport husks. Occasionally, I came across human scavengers, always masked, always silent. We didn't engage. They recognized the way I moved, not a threat, not prey, just a shadow like them. I reached a coalition outpost on the 5th day. It was barely functional. A satellite comms relay disguised as a crater station, held together by rust and paranoia. The sentries didn't challenge me. They scanned me, confirmed my outdated credentials, and waved me through like a ghost returning to its grave. Inside, the commander's chamber smelled like sterilized regret, polished armor, dim lights, a single plant growing under artificial sun, a fragment of Lyriath Prime's native flora. Seeing it made my chest tighten. I hadn't realized how long it had been since I smelled something green. The commander was Viral, a tactician from the Northern Orbital Academies, famous for his strategic coldness. He wore his medals like they were warnings. When he saw me, his face pinched, not with recognition but calculation. "You're listed MIA," he said. "We assumed disintegration." "Not yet," I answered. He didn't smile. I handed him the datapod, without a word. He took it carefully, like it might detonate. When he plugged it into the relay hub, the lights flickered. The first file auto-played, a recorded plea from a captured human child, no older than 10 solar cycles, explaining the bombing of her village. Viral paused the feed. "Where did you get this?" "From Truth," I replied, "from underneath." He didn't ask more. He didn't need to. I knew then what this meant. The datapod wouldn't be broadcast. Not yet. It would be analyzed, redacted, buried under encryption layers until it became another classified artifact to shame. That was the way of bureaucracy, alien or otherwise. But I planted it. The first stone in a flood. They debriefed me for hours. Standard questions, casualty confirmations, strategic observations. What did I know about human resistance networks? What new weapons had I seen? Did I suspect internal dissent within our own ranks? I answered none of them in the way they wanted. Instead, I spoke of the red-eyed soldiers who didn't bury their dead, of Viren's eyes as he bled under Earth's dust, of Mara's voice in the dark and the children with circuitry in their skulls who hummed in 2 languages. They recorded it all, and when they were done, they offered me reassignment. A desk, they said, or a comms role on the Arclight vessel preparing to retake Lunar Contingent Zone 7. I said no. Instead, I asked for a transfer to the Outer Ring Observer Corps, where soldiers weren't soldiers anymore, just watchers, listeners, people forgotten by the war until the war needed someone else to blame. They approved it without comment. No one argues when a ghost chooses exile. I spent the next 6 months on the perimeter of the Orion Grave Belt, monitoring, translating, waiting. Some days, it felt like I had escaped the war entirely. Other days, it felt like the war had just become quieter. The datapod was never spoken of again, but I began receiving encrypted signals. flickers of resonance buried in the static, voices I recognized, a priest's prayer in old dialect, a child's song set to starlight patterns. Sometimes, I even heard Mara's breath before the words began. The chorus lived. They were still speaking. And in time, others started to listen. The broadcast spread slowly, hidden in dead frequencies, relayed by damaged satellites drifting too far from inspection. Stories began to leak, not in headlines or official reports, but in whispers, in soldier dreams, in the sudden stillness of firing squads that lower their weapons without knowing why. War is not ended by treaties. Not truly. It is ended in the minds of those who choose not to carry it forward. And some began choosing. I don't know if humanity ever forgave us, or if we ever forgave them, but something changed, subtle, like the wind shifting before a storm breaks. One day, I walked out beneath an unfiltered sky. No armor, no mask, just breath and open skin. A human transport flew overhead. It didn't stop, but it didn't fire either. That was enough. It's been years now, by your calendar. My hair has silvered, my pulse slows, but I still remember the rhythm of fire and silence. I still carry the faces of those who vanished in dust. And I still wait for the day when the broadcasts no longer need encryption, when the truth is no longer dangerous. Until then, I remain a witness, and in this final breath of war's long night, I will say again what I could not before. We came thinking we were wiser. You showed us what survival truly means. But somewhere between your fire and our arrogance, we found something neither side expected. We found memory. And memory never forgets.